Welcome readers, we would like to introduce the story The Bell Tolls for Me. A succession crisis consumed the kingdom of Dovehane following the death of Edgar the Great. In the treacherous royal court, Princess Isabella had endured every indignity, overcame countless injustices, and fought against the most vicious of enemies. At first it had been for survival, but in time, it became for hope of a better future. She became the queen, only to be betrayed by those she trusted most. Somehow, Isabella woke up 8 years in the past, 1 week after her father's death. Though she's once again found herself in the tempest of misery that is the royal court, she hasn't lost everything. The experience and knowledge that she gained in the struggle for the throne might help her steer fate in the direction that she wishes. But the question she naturally poses to herself is a difficult one. Should she pursue her own happiness, or attempt to better the realm? She might pursue paths long denied to her, exploring the depths of magic, forging lasting bonds with people she can trust, and gaining fulfillment she once thought an impossibility. Or, will she dare reach for it all? Great bells chimed melodically, faintly audible through the glass windows. Isabella opened her eyes, looking toward the origin of the pleasant noise. She tried to turn her head, but she couldn't. Her illness had sapped all of the energy out of her, and now she could barely watch and listen. 8 different bells, 8 different tones. She couldn't see them, but she'd never forget them. Those are the royal bells, Isabella realized. They only ring upon the rise of a new monarch. Isabella's already troubled breathing hastened. She was queen. She had fallen ill, yes, but she hadn't yet died. What was the meaning of this? Her faithful paladin, Gasper, was ruling with a council in her stead ever since her illness developed months ago. The only claimant to the throne was 3 years old. They couldn't possibly stage a coup. Gasper had helped her win the throne. Why would he betray her? As her mind tried to reason out what was happening, the door opened. A woman in a solemn black mourning dress walked in with an eager gait, coming to stand over Isabella's bedside. When she pulled back the veil covering her face, Isabella felt some relief. Bernadetta was her closest cousin, she would explain things. But her rich purple eyes, they stared down at her maliciously. "I can't stay long, dear Isabella. I have to attend your funeral," she said, her voice a thin whip. Isabella almost couldn't believe this was Bernadetta. "I had to see you for myself. My proud cousin, daughter of Edgar the Great, one last time," Bernadetta said venomously as she sat down by her bedside, studying Isabella's face. She pulled a hairpin out of her hair, letting her black locks fall down. She seemed to push the hairpin down into the bed, but eventually stopped with disappointment. "It's true, what they said. You can't even feel pain anymore. Such a shame." Her cousin put her hairpin behind her ear, its tip was red with blood. Isabella realized what she'd been doing, stabbing Isabella's hand. She hadn't felt a thing. She had never seen this side of Bernadetta. Sometimes people are so far behind in the race, they think they are leading. Bernadetta looked at her ponderously. "But victory isn't enough for me. I want you to know. You need to know. You need to suffer." Isabella tried to fight against her illness, but it was fruitless. It had an ironclad grip over her body. Bernadetta leaned closer. "You aren't ill, cousin. You were poisoned by the man you trust most. You had no true supporters, you had only sycophants, who propped you up as a stepping stone for the man who will become my husband." She placed her hand on Isabella's cheek. Once Bernadetta's touch had been comforting, but now it was nauseating. "Officially, you died 3 days ago. Your body will be burned because of your disease, and cast to the wind. Ah. But it gets better. We've been making good use of your name, Queen Isabella." Bernadetta smiled widely. "You'll be remembered as the tyrant that revoked countless privileges, that raised the taxes to record highs, that executed political opponents, that undermined the church. My. I could go on and on about the things we did under your name. If you could look out the window, you'd see the masses cheering for your death." Isabella, through sheer force of will, managed to wheeze out one word that was half question, half indignance. "Why? Why?" Bernadetta's face turned to rage. You ask me that? You? She grasped Isabella's shoulders, and launched into a fast-paced tirade. You, all high and mighty, lording your supposed virtue over everyone. Acting so self-righteous, like nothing could shake you. Even when your life kept getting dragged through the mud. Bernadetta's nails dug into Isabella's shoulder as she pushed her down harder. Did you think we couldn't see that you thought you were better than us? Always proud, always regal, always aloof. Never erring, never indulging. But it was all ego, all about your legacy. Well. Bernadetta smiled. I want you to know precisely who will write your history, who will close your book. Isabella closed her eyes, not giving Bernadetta the satisfaction of more rage, of more entertainment. She wanted to cry, to despair. But as ever, she wouldn't allow herself. You sacrificed so much. Endured so much. I was curious to see how you got out of this one, frankly, Bernadetta said with a rich laugh. But it's good to finally know that you're lesser than me. I'd always thought as much, but the confirmation. It tastes sweet. Like frosting on sugar cookies, huh? She sighed wistfully. Well. Enough. Bernadetta rose to her feet, and Isabella opened her eyes to watch her walk out. The woman practically skipped to the door, but at the frame, she hesitated. She looked back, then walked over once more with purpose. They won't like this, but... Bernadetta reached behind Isabella, pulling the pillow out from behind my head. But I'm going to be a queen. What they think doesn't matter much. I need satisfaction. Bernadetta stuffed the pillow over Isabella's face. The velvet pillow pressed firmly against her face, and though she couldn't feel the pain, she could feel the air catching in her mouth and her nose, struggling both to escape or intake. As Isabella's already weakened breath faltered, the blackness of sleep consumed her. This promised to be the longest sleep she'd ever known. Chapter 1. Great bells chimed melodically, faintly audible through the glass windows. Isabella opened her eyes, looking toward the origin of the pleasant noise. She tried to turn her head. And could. Isabella sat up quickly, gasping and touching her throat. She felt her neck, then her face. Not moments ago, they'd been leathery, weak, almost hollow. She couldn't feel a single thing. Now, things were different. Her body felt alive and full of vigor. She looked around, taking in the sights. This is my old room, she realized at once. The tacky red walls. My father had them painted this color. Then. Isabella stood up, feeling vigor that she hadn't in months. She very nearly tripped over her own feet as she moved around the room. She ran to the window, peering up. Outside, the 8 royal bell towers rang mightily. She faintly saw her own reflection in the window, but it was vague and muddled, and looked far different than she remembered. She turned her head, then walked to her old mirror. A young woman, almost a stranger to her, after so long, looked back at Isabella in a nightgown. Her face was pale with faint color, framed by straight silver-white hair that cascaded to her waist. Her eyes were a radiant burgundy. Isabella's skin, which she recalled had felt like parchment after the withering illness had taken her, was now unblemished. Isabella always had a cold, emotionless face. People always told her she was the opposite of her father, who could always be seen smiling. Now, though, her own shock looked back at her. Shock, surprise, joy. They all twisted her face into a mask of expression that she had never seen her own face bear. But it was hers. This felt real. Isabella of Devane looked and felt young again, unburdened by her illness. Dream, delusion, fantasy? It hardly mattered after being trapped in a bed for so long. Isabella looked around, taking in the room and puzzling out her situation. She had been moved out of this room not long after her father's death. Considering that, and considering the bells, this was the day of her half-brother Edgar's coronation. She had been 18, then. He was named King Edgar II a week after the death of her father, Edgar the Great, who had founded the Devane dynasty. Edgar II only ruled for 3 weeks before he was murdered, Isabella reflected. Then there was Claude. Then Claude died. 7 weeks later? And then his 1-year-old son, Edgar, became Edgar III. Then Edgar III was deposed in favor of Sylvain. The names carried on from there, without an end in sight. Isabella had risen to the throne with the hopes of doing away with the constant, internecine politics. But in the end, she was just another name, wasn't she? Isabella I, who died of a withering disease after a long regency council. She supposed it had been a withering poison, if Bernadetta had spoken truly. What had it all been for? She'd wanted to put an end to the cycle, turn the government back toward governance instead of the unending wars of succession. But she'd just ended up another casualty of them. She could still feel that pillow, bearing down on her face. All the indignities she'd endured, all the things that she'd set aside, all the happiness she'd abandoned. And it all meant nothing. Bernadetta's words were still raw in her head. She thought her cousin loved her. She thought she had steadfast allies that believed in her vision. But they had poisoned her, dragged her name through the mud, and then Bernadetta herself had smothered her. Isabella prided herself on composure, but she couldn't help but tear up thinking of it. The door to her room opened, and a short maid entered. She had a cheeky smile and wore her long brown hair tied back in a ponytail. Ah! Instinctually, Isabella wiped at her eyes and comported herself. She never liked others seeing her cry. The girl placed her hands before me. I should have knocked, Princess Isabella. Forgive me. I wasn't thinking clearly. After making sure her voice wouldn't tremor, Isabella said, It's fine. Carry on. Thank you, the girl said in relief. Your brother King Edgar instructed me to attend to you before the coronation. Shall I return in some time, or would you like to get ready now? Immediately, Isabella said decisively. Oh. Wonderful, said the young maid, smiling brightly. I'll draw your bath. As the girl moved about in the background, Isabella looked in the mirror. The wound of the betrayal was still raw. But even it wasn't harsh enough to make her overlook what was happening. She didn't quite understand how, or why. But this felt as real as the first time that she'd done it. If this was a dream, she didn't wish to wake up. If this was a delusion brought about by her illness, it was a pleasant reprieve. If this was the afterlife, well, she'd learn soon enough. But if it was real, what in the world was she going to do now? Asterisk. Alice brushed the hair of Princess Isabella with great, yet restrained, zeal. She had been more than a little flustered upon receiving word that she would be attending to the infamously taciturn Princess Isabella, so much so that she had made a fool of herself by entering without the proper procedure. She never expected to see the princess shedding tears. She misses her father, Alice reasoned sympathetically. Who wouldn't? The princess' radiant eyes seemed totally divorced from the situation, staring into the mirror without seeing anything within. It's my job to prepare the princess, Alice said. Both in mind, and in appearance. She doesn't need much help on the appearance front. But perhaps I can cheer her up. Your hair is so beautiful, Your Highness, Alice said, idly brushing it. Would you like to wear it in any particular fashion? As is, Isabella answered simply. All the better. It looks great just like this, Alice said with a sheepish laugh. Now, is there any particular dress you have in mind? If I may. I believe you'd look radiant in this. Alice moved to the wardrobe and retrieved an ivory white dress of silk and lace with cloth of silver woven into it tastefully. It'll allow your natural beauty to flourish. Isabella gave a curt nod and stood, and Alice walked over with the dress happily. After dutifully helping the princess fit into it, she studied the young woman from afar. Isabella looked positively captivating, her lithe figure and naturally graceful posture. Of all Edgar's children, Isabella looked the most like the late king, but Alice elected not to mention that. I'm sure you'll be the center of attention, Your Highness. Alice clapped her hands eagerly, smiling brightly. The princess sat back down before the mirror, disaffected. Alice, disappointed she'd failed in eliciting a smile thus far, walked back up. Alice stared into the mirror ponderously. I think, if it pleases Your Highness, I'll only apply some light makeup. Your skin is perfect, so too much would subtract rather than add. She smiled brightly as she stared into the princess' eyes. The headmate probably gave me this job because I couldn't possibly make a mistake. After all, Her Highness will be beautiful no matter what I do." Isabella met her gaze in the mirror, and smiled faintly. "You're very kind, Alice." Alice's heart skipped a beat as her name was mentioned. She hadn't recalled ever giving it. Meaning the princess remembered it, even though she'd only been here for a month at most. "I am honored the princess assesses me so. And I hope the coronation can be not unduly stressful." The princess said no more, and Alice worked to dutifully apply her mock-up. She hadn't been exaggerating much when she said there wasn't much to do, and she was finished before long. As Alice went to retrieve the princess' jewelry casket. "Do you believe the afterlife can be blissful, no matter what you did before you reached it?" the princess asked. Alice paused, holding the casket of jewels in her hand. I'm not sure, Your Highness." She walked up, and set the jewelry casket down. "I like to believe so. Elsewise I'd spend all day worrying about my brother," she managed with a quiet chuckle. Isabella looked back to the mirror thoughtfully. "I hope that it is." Alice opened the jewelry casket, rummaging through the necklaces and rings. She hadn't expected the princess to open up to her, of all people. But then, who did Isabella have around to talk to? In a rush of sympathy, Alice said, "I'll do my best to make sure you're happy, princess." When she realized what she had said, butterflies disturbed her stomach. She was just a lowly maid, why in the world was she running her mouth? Isabella smiled once more. "Perhaps there's a chance at that." Alice grinned in relief, then looked toward the jewelry casket. "Now, perhaps we can find a gemstone that matches your beautiful eyes." ****. A priest in immaculate white vestments lowered a grandiose gold crown upon the head of a young and handsome man with silver hair and pale skin. His eyes were the color of red wine, and they scanned the vast crowd arrayed before him with a lazy sense of superiority. He was draped in white and gold in abundance. He might have looked an angel if not for his cold, callous eyes. As the priest stepped away, a fat old man with skin reminiscent of a slightly rotten potato limped up the stairs with a cane on hand. He turned slowly once coming to the throne, shouting to the assembled, "All kneel for King Edgar II." Isabella finally heard the words she had been waiting for and knelt down as quickly as she could. "Just as I remember this," she thought as she looked upon the king. "That old man is—" "No need for undue ceremony, Duke Albert," said the king, waving his gloved hand lightly as he rose. "All of you, rise." "Duke Albert," she confirmed, feeling a chill rush up her spine. "I thought he was gone. I counted every day that he was with joy. After the military and economic reforms of my father, our kingdom of Dovehane stands at the heart of a golden age," Edgar II proclaimed grandly. "But I don't intend for this to be its peak. I intend to continue our ascent for my first year, my second, and the many decades to come." As polite claps filled the throne room, Isabella's brain was entirely elsewhere. There's half a dozen future kings in attendance. And as many kingmakers. Isabella's eyes flitted about, scanning the crowd. It's a vicious tempest of factions. No matter what I do, I remain the daughter of the first king. A valuable marriage for many, a useful tool for some, and a target for elimination for the most treacherous among them. The court won't let me leave here under my own steam. My father well deserves the sobriquet of the great, Edgar II continued. But only the gods are perfect. The winds of change come. We'll explore that together in the years to come. I won't say too much of yet, but our rivals have bested us at sea once before. With the aid of the Duke of the Isles, I intend to make a grand armada that shall dominate the most distant reaches of the ocean, bringing with them riches unimaginable. As her half-brother's speech droned, Isabella could only think of all that she had endured in this hellish place. She'd entered an engagement with the 70-year-old Duke Albert breathing heavily beside the king, endured the reprisals and retributions of her squabbling siblings, and suffered the mercurial excesses of the ever-changing regal mandates. She had done things that she wasn't proud of, first for survival, then for hope of putting an end to the misery that had been wrought upon her family and the people. Still, with all Isabella learned, all the experience she had gained, couldn't it all go so much smoother? But for now, let us enjoy the celebration of Dovhain's continued golden age. Let us drink, dance, and make merry in the ballroom, the king finished grandly. Isabella stirred as the guests to the coronation around her began to move. All of the most prominent figures of the age would be at this event. Old allies, old enemies, all on a blank slate, though of which she had tremendous knowledge. As she walked, she thought of Bernadetta's words. "You were poisoned by the man you trust most." Isabella couldn't think of a name that jumped out immediately. She had several trusted advisors. But one thing was all but certain, that man would almost definitely be at this ball today. She wouldn't rule out justice for the Isabella that had died. Chapter 2 Isabella had been standing on the sidelines of the ball, tactfully refusing all requests to dance. The people that had been requesting her hand were all part of various factions, and to dance with one would send a sign to various others. The factions weren't clearly defined yet, but her actions were being noted. Even dancing with one of her half-brothers might damn her. There were only a few people she reasonably could accept the hand of. And eventually, "Would you care to dance, Your Highness Isabella?" Gaspar of Forseth, Knight Commander of the Holy Paladins, offered his hand. Garbed in pure white finery with a long cloak displaying a vibrant golden sun, he stood out in the crowd with his tall figure honed both in training and on the battlefield. He had lovely blonde locks, piercing blue eyes, and an easy smile, all working in tandem for quite the handsome look. "I would," Isabella said, placing her hand atop his. The two of them swept out into the center of the ballroom to join the slow-paced waltz, where many eyes fell upon them. Isabella stood firm and unshaking in the midst of their gaze. The Holy Paladins were the personal guard of the king, chosen from the ranks of the paladins in the church. Officially, they were neutral. This man would change that, becoming the leader of the theocratic faction when he deposed the child King Edgar III. And later, he helped Isabella rise to the throne, where he became her military advisor. If there was someone I trusted the most personally, it was Gaspar, Isabella reflected as she danced the steps effortlessly. By now, this dance was ingrained in her so deeply she could do it while sleeping. He saved me from numerous assassins. He bled for me, very nearly died for me. He seemed straightforward, earnest. But I never knew what he was thinking. She looked into those blue eyes of his. "Did you kill me, Gaspar?" "Thank you for your consideration," Isabella said to him. His brow raised slightly. "What consideration, Your Highness?" "If I danced with none, it might be seen as a protest. If I danced with some, it might be seen as a statement. But the Knight Commander of the Holy Paladins remained neutral." Gaspar smiled at her. "You do me too much honor. I had no such considerations. I merely desired to share a dance with Your Highness." "Nevertheless, thank you." She twirled gracefully, then took his hand once more as they danced in lockstep. "You know the doctrines of our faith intimately, yes?" "I do," he said without hesitation. "Would the gods grant a mortal a second chance?" Gaspar's face turned pensive at her unexpectedly strong question. "It is in their nature to forgive, just as it is in man's nature to sin." Isabella took his words in stride. "If we had failed at something, and the gods gave us that second chance, would we be expected to try again?" Gaspar grew yet more thoughtful. "I don't dare presume, but does Her Highness have a specific scenario in mind?" "Yes," Isabella said. "But our time is nearly over. I do wonder if you'll be so convenient a partner for me in the years to come." Gaspar seemed uneased by her words as the music entered a lull. Isabella split away from him, searching for her next partner in this two-part dance. She found him quickly, fortunately, Arthur of Hamor, the named successor of the Arch-Wizard. He dressed in natural tones, brown and green, likely to support his hair and eyes of the same tone. His brown hair was tied lazily back, and his sharp, suspicious green eyes were framed by rectangular glasses. Isabella offered her hand to Arthur. "Shall we?" Arthur, who'd been standing on the sidelines, studied her offered hand and then met her gaze. "Your Highness should be aware that I am unskilled at dancing." "I was aware," she pressed, keeping her hand out. As the music began to resume, Arthur, hesitant to refuse her twice, took her hand and moved toward the center of the ballroom alongside her. They joined in the second phase of the waltz. Arthur wasn't as skilled as Gasper, but he wasn't as terrible as he suggested. He was merely uneased by intimate contact, but Isabella did her best to accommodate him. The title of Archwizard, and by extension the title of his successor, was a title removed from many of the dictates of the royal court. Both the present Archwizard and Arthur practiced firm neutrality. They were one of the few who could manage that here, because their services as spellcasters would always be coveted no matter who rose to the throne. Arthur was the person whom I trusted the most professionally, Isabella mused internally. If there was something I wanted done properly, I could always rely on him. There was no greater master of magic. Even in matters of statesmanship, he effortlessly outdid the nobles that had spent their lives preparing for governance. I named him my regent, even. More than that, I had him instruct me on magic. At 25, my body was fully developed. I was incapable of actually using magic, because it required forming a monologue within one's mind. Now that I'm once again 18, perhaps I can form a monologue. It'd be pushing things, but certainly not impossible. Arthur was the most competent teacher I'd ever had, and his teachings stuck. His competence did make her confront a dark fact, though. If anyone was capable of concocting a poison that withered her body, it would be Arthur. He could easily have poisoned her. Do you know of any magics that allow mastery of time itself, Arthur? She asked spontaneously. Arthur, stone-faced, replied, it is against my master's wishes to discuss any magic research, ongoing or finished, with a member of the royal family besides the king. Arthur was unfailingly stiff and formal, like a great impenetrable wall. But Isabella still pressed, perhaps you could share something on an informal basis. That would imply informality between us, he said, standing his ground. Isabella smiled slightly. He hadn't changed in many years. Whether past or present, he never let his mask of propriety slip. She never quite knew where she stood with him. Then off the subject of magic. Do you know of any disease or poison that causes one's skin to turn rough like parchment, and strength and sensation to slowly leave their body? It has no cure, so far as I can tell. He narrowed his eyes. You ask very bizarre questions. Curiosity is a powerful emotion. Isabella repeated something he told her once in her past life. His hand tightened around hers before he remembered that he was dancing with a princess. An interesting sentiment, Your Highness. She said no more, taking the hint that he didn't intend to answer any questions. She'd always respected Arthur's distance from the politics of the court, but perhaps that was merely a clever guise to hide away deeper ambitions. There was nothing in the world that said a successor needed to follow the neutral mandate of their predecessor, and Arthur was soon to become the Archwizard of Dauphine. Skin like parchment. I'm unfamiliar with such an affliction, Arthur said, surprising her. But my knowledge on the field is lacking. Next time we speak, I'll have an answer to both questions. How generous, she said. And no, I didn't. I'm only joking, she interrupted him with another slight smile. That's already much more than I hoped for. Thank you, Arthur. Arthur didn't respond to her words of thanks as the song came to a close. He stepped away to the balcony, cleaning his glasses as he walked. The man had always disliked attention and contact, and she felt guilty for troubling him. But Isabella, having danced one song, had fulfilled what was expected of her in the eyes of the nobles and the king. She retreated to a secluded corner where she might relax and gather her thoughts. Or at least, she'd hoped to. King Edgar II of Dauphine split the crowd as he walked toward her, with his arrogant gait and cocksure smile. He offered his hand to Isabella. Dance the next song with me, Isabella, Edgar said, and order, not a request. Isabella swallowed. She wanted to refuse. The man before her was perhaps the worst king to ever grace Dauphine. It was because of his indiscretions and excesses that the kingdom was thrown into the perpetual succession crisis that had flavored her life. He was paranoid, vindictive, sadistic, delusional, and ill-educated. But he was still the king. Isabella took his hand, and he roughly walked back to the center of the ballroom as the next song began to play. She had a feeling she knew what he wanted to say, to do. "Duke Albert informed me that he saw you smiling as you danced with the wizard Arthur," the king said as they danced. "Yet what do I see? The same dour face as ever, even after I deigned to share a dance with you on my special day." Isabella managed a polite smile, though her stomach turned when she heard that Duke Albert had already been watching her. "Forgive me. I was nervous." "There we are," Edgar said with a hint of triumph. "Men like a smiling face, sister. You need to smile more. You're of age for marriage. For stability in the kingdom, it's imperative that you smile." Isabella could see the message beneath the words, that he was already looking for marriage partners for her. In her last life, that had fated her to endure the twisted obsession of Duke Albert, a man 52 years her senior. That engagement had been the worst of her misery. She had managed to turn that scenario to her benefit, but— "I've had thoughts on that subject, Your Majesty," Isabella said fearlessly, widening her smile. "If I may be so bold, I believe that I can help secure a marriage of tremendous benefit to you." Now, though, she wasn't willing to be so meekly overwhelmed. She would have to seize the initiative. "That's my matter to decide," Edgar too said, pettily asserting his authority. "Still. With whom?" "I dare not speak of the subject with so many birds listening," she said, playing on his paranoia. "Still, I shall support your reign as ably as I can. You have good sense." "On both points," the king said in a low voice. "But there are some things I don't mind being overheard. What of value could you possibly bring me when I have the wealthiest duke in the kingdom asking for your hand?" Isabella came to an unpleasant confirmation. "It's definitely Duke Albert. He was probably speaking to Edgar long before this coronation even happened. If he has already got it set in his mind. All I ask is for the chance to prove my worth," Isabella said, looking Edgar right in the eyes. As she looked in Edgar II's eyes, she saw a petty imp within, something that couldn't stand to see others happy, to see others' success. "One way or another, my royal court will be downsized, Isabella. My father entertained far too many buffoons, and had far too many children. I can't fault him for taking mistresses, but I still have to clean up his mess. If you should try and make a fool of me in a matter regarding my steadfast ally, I'm not opposed to making an example of you for the rest. Then I shall strive to serve as an example of utter loyalty," she said in turn. "As a leal subject that elevates their monarch into greater heights through their good works." Edgar finally smiled, but no life came to those eyes of his. "You've volunteered to be made example of, then. Whether you'll serve as a monument of fear to my enemies, or a statue of the king's grace to his allies, that shall rest solely on you, Isabella." Isabella nodded determinedly. She had caught the king's attention, but bought herself freedom of movement. A fine trade-off, in her eyes. "Still, the partners that one dances with at my coronation. It is to hold some significance, no?" Edgar raised a brow. As the music lulled, it became time to switch partner. As Edgar's words sunk in, she realized what his intent was, and soon enough, she saw it as well. Duke Albert limped toward her, his intention to join the dance obvious. As they parted, Edgar lifted her hand up and kissed the back of the palm. "Smile for your next partner, dear sister. Consider that a royal mandate." If there was one thing that Isabella hoped she could avoid in this life more than anything else, it would be the engagement with Duke Albert. It was far more than the fact that he was old and corpulent. He was a twisted man that didn't view people as people at all, merely commodities to be traded and sold. Duke Albert had made tremendous wealth from the arts, patronizing artists and authors. He treated his beneficiaries cruelly, elaborately manipulating, abusing, and entrapping them with his connections. To offend Albert was to end your career as an artist. During her engagement with Albert, Isabella had been forced to wear especially revealing, salacious garments while she had her painting taken by a suite of his artists. They were instructed to use her as the model for the goddesses of the pantheon. She'd been forced to stand for 8 hours, day after day after day, often with little more than a blanket draped over her figure. That alone was humiliating enough, but the Duke had then sold those paintings of her in his auction as he would any other pieces. Portraits bearing her figure and her face propagated most noble households. Every time that she went out, people watched, talked, compared. People knew. And all the while, Duke Albert and the king propped it up as though she should be honored to have been granted the opportunity. Like they had done her a favor, even when the Duke refused to let her see a single coin of what he earned. "I've made my fiancée far more famous than me," Duke Albert boasted in her memories. "I've made her a goddess in the eyes of men, and my vault the envy of the realm. It's an enviable partnership. Don't you agree?" When Isabella was finally free of him, she vowed to never have another portrait made. In this second life, she most certainly didn't wish to share a dance with him like nothing had ever happened. Just the sight of him as he limped over made her tense, uneasy. The thought of him holding her hand, while the other slid around her back. It almost made her nauseous. Her eyes darted around for any other partner she might take, but the other seemed to know Albert's intent, and backed away so as not to offend him. All except one. Isabella stepped forward and offered her hand to a man in humbler dark gray clothes. She presumed him to be of a lower house, perhaps ennobled by merit. He was tall, broad, and stood as straight as a man of the battlefield. Such a man might not even recognize Duke Albert. He was tanner than the sheltered nobles, further adding credence to her assumption he was ennobled by merit. "Shall we dance, sir?" Isabella asked him hastily. The man turned his head, and she saw his face more clearly. He was quite handsome, certainly enough that she'd recognize him if she'd seen him in the royal court many times before. He had a scar on his right brow that extended diagonally to his temple, and another on his left cheek. His hair was dark and fell slightly past his ears, while his eyes were so black they resembled a bottomless hole. He had quite the intimidating, stern look with a sharp jawline and intense eyes. "As you wish, Your Highness," he answered, taking her hand. Isabella didn't need to feign her smile as the second act of the music began, and they resumed the waltz. Despite his size, he proved a graceful partner. She saw Duke Albert standing there with anger in his eyes, but he quickly retreated out of view so as not to make a fool of himself. "I apologize if this causes you trouble," she said quietly, looking up at her partner. He narrowed his eyes. Why would it? Isabella felt guilty at the prospect that he was clueless about what he'd done. "Duke Albert is a vindictive man, and he wanted this dance," she explained. "But don't worry. I'll do what I can to ensure nothing comes back on you." He raised a brow. "You'll do that for me?" "Of course," she said resolutely. "Perhaps not in the way you're familiar, but nevertheless." He laughed from his nose and gave a cynical smile. "I can hold my own. I insist. Just give me your name, and you'll receive no disruptions to your life." The man continued the dance for a while without saying anything, but Isabella didn't press. She merely stared at him, silently prompting for his answer. In her experience, silence made people uncomfortable, and they usually spoke up simply to break it. But the man seemed intimately familiar with silence, and the dance progressed as a silent staring contest. When the music began to slow to signal the end, he leaned down and said simply, "Valerio." It was a common enough name. She could think of several counts and barons named Valerio. "And the name of your house, Valerio?" She pressed further. "A name should be enough," Valerio answered, stepping away as the song closed. "Though it seems to me you should worry about yourself, Your Highness." Asterisk. Isabella leaned on the balcony railing, more exhausted than she'd expected. She thought that these days of endless anxiety and stress were behind her, but now she was thrust back into the very heart of it. Things had moved forward so fast, and she simply reverted to old preservationist habits by instinct. There was barely any time to process what was happening to her, let alone why. As her eyes wandered the hedges of the royal garden, she reflected on what the king had said. She'd be made an example of, one way or another. To wax poetic, Edgar had thrown her into a pit of spikes, but there was a single spot that had a velvet pillow to land on. "I can't prevent an engagement," she accepted. "Edgar doesn't want me to become a threat to him, so he'll use me to either guarantee alliances or win over enemies. He makes terrible decisions, but he is decisive. So I need to act quickly. Duke Albert wasn't someone that could be easily disregarded. He had friends and allies, earned over 70 years of life, tremendous wealth from his own territory and his patronage of artists, and enough troops that her brother the king thought it absolutely essential to keep Albert placated. Finding someone that could stand up against him and also entice the king seemed quite impossible. Isabella had been in the court of Devane long enough to know that things were never as they seemed. As she thought of possible candidates, someone joined her on the balcony. She turned her head, and had to make an effort to conceal her reaction. Bernadetta, in a regal lavender dress, leaned up against the railing. "Bella," her cousin greeted affectionately. "Quite the day, isn't it?" Isabella studied her cousin's face with her smiling purple eyes. Even now, the memory of being smothered with a pillow played in her head. The face that she saw now was the perfect representation of friendliness, compassion, kindness. It didn't have a flaw that she could see. But then, perhaps she had never truly looked very hard. "Bernie," she responded in kind. Her cousin hated that nickname, so now she used it freely. "I'm glad you're here." Bernadetta gave a stiff smile. "That nickname is a little Bernie and Bella. BB. It's perfect, isn't it?" Isabella smiled. "It's like we are twins, or sisters. I've always thought of you that way. And you smothered me while I was helpless in return," Isabella thought. "When did you come to hate me so much? Or was our friendship always a lie?" Bernadetta swallowed and changed the subject, remarking, "You caused quite the stir today. You're not usually so bold." Isabella looked out to the gardens. "I'm unsure what you mean." "Come now, don't be coy." Bernadetta moved closer. Dancing with the Knight Commander, the Archwizard's heir, the king himself, and then the Duke of the Isles. Isabella's brain paused upon hearing the last name. The Duke of the Isles. She repeated, to be sure that she hadn't misheard. "Duke Valerio," Bernadetta said. "Oh. Did you not know? If you didn't, it doesn't matter now. Everyone is talking about it. Very few people have seen the pirate lord up close. He came especially for the coronation." Isabella went silent. Everyone knew who the Duke of the Isles was. His title rung up from north to south, from the lowest barony to the highest dukedom. He was a pirate of fearsome renown whose fleet once had a stranglehold on all of the shipping lanes leaving Devane. He had based himself in an archipelago bridging the inland sea to the wider ocean. Isabella didn't know too many details, but Valerio allied himself with her father, and in a fateful engagement, lost the majority of his fleet to secure victory for Devane. As recompense, her father King Edgar the Great had raised him to the title of Duke, enfeoffing him with the archipelago on which he'd established himself. It was a back-ended appointment. Without the ships, the chain of islands he owned was useless. It's certainly not the first time I've seen him. But I remember him looking different. She thought back. Duke Valerio had attended her coronation, too. The face. It roughly aligned to the one she remembered. But his eyes were as white as the moon, and his hair. Was it black? No, I think it was gray. She shook her head, dismissing the thoughts. I can't remember. Whatever the case, she was somewhat relieved. Valerio was another neutral party. He didn't involve himself in the politics of the court. As far as she knew, he mostly stayed at sea or in his coastal estate here in the capital, rarely attending events. But a memory from today resurfaced even as she thought of that. King Edgar had mentioned Duke Valerio during his coronation speech. He said he intended to build an armada with the help of the Duke of the Isles. She supposed it was another grand ambition that was interrupted by the perpetual succession crisis of the Kingdom of Devane. Now you're back to as you were normally, Bernadetta said. Standing there without a word, making others ask all of the questions. Her cousin inched closer. What was he like? He seemed an adequate answer. It doesn't matter, Isabella answered. I'm not likely to see him again. Asterisk. King Edgar sat in one of the many dressing rooms throughout the royal court, sipping the finest wine out of an immaculately carved glass. In many ways, his life hadn't changed much. This was always the lifestyle afforded to him. but in others. He was now the king. King Edgar II. Perhaps I should adopt a new name, Edgar mused. A regnal name. What do you think, Albert? I think it's inevitable that your majesty is going to be the only Edgar remembered, Albert praised unabashedly. Edgar looked at him. What do you want from me? You're leaning forward on your chair, that means you want something. I'm merely curious when your majesty is going to announce my engagement with Isabella, Albert said. Princess Isabella, Edgar reminded him. Don't forget you're speaking of the royal family, Albert. He looked at the man and said very deliberately, my sister's engagement will be announced on my time. Albert fell back into his chair, cowed. I've already hired the portrait artists, your majesty. My household is ready to receive her. Are you telling me I should revolve my decisions around your awful scheduling, your overzealous assumptions? Edgar shook his head. This is not my problem. Should I move at your pace, or mine? Albert scratched his leg where his old scar was. You set the pace of the kingdom, your majesty. Exactly, Edgar agreed, then took another drink. Duke Albert's expression shifted to one of calculation. He thought for a few moments, nodded, then leaned in once more to say, would your majesty be interested in examining some of the new exhibits before they go to the auction? Albert suggested. I've had the work of some very promising artists come to market. Some of them are from old favorites of yours. Edgar pointed a finger. Now that sounds lovely. Any work from that fellow? What was his name, Santiago? Santiago. Albert's face scrunched up. He's been. Yes, your majesty. One of his pieces will be there. Good. Great. Edgar praised. Send me an invitation, and I'll attend. Silence settled between the two men. There was a tacit quid pro quo between them. 1 week, Edgar said decisively. I'll announce my sister's engagement in 1 week. If Isabella can surprise me in a week, why not indulge her? Duke Albert's already thrown in his lot with me, he's not going to leave so easily for one pretty face. Still, unless she can surprise me, I'll keep him placated. Have to feed the piggy what he wants to make it all the fatter for the slaughter. I wonder how those flappy shins of his would look severed from his body. Thank you for your magnanimity, King Edgar, Albert said, bowing his head. Yeah, sure, he said idly, then swirled his glass. Edgar. Perhaps I could become Richard. Leo. Julius. Henry. Edward. The archbishops of the church take new names when they assume the office, why not the king? A reasonable question, your majesty, Duke Albert said. Perhaps Arundel. Or Eric. Or Louis. Lucian. Or, perhaps I can just make up a name. All words are made up, after all. Chapter 4. Isabella collapsed on her bed, glad to have some reprieve. She was experiencing nostalgia, but she wouldn't say that it was a positive feeling. Things were back to as they had been before she became queen. The royal court had been like a vast, stormy sea in which she desperately tried not to drown. At the end of every day, her room had once been like a solitary breath of air to keep her from drowning. I've been thrown back in again. But this time, I know how to swim, Isabella thought, doing her best to stay positive. My lungs are stronger, my endurance is trained, and best of all, I know how to navigate the sea. I will make it to shore. I will survive. It was unimaginable, but Isabella had fallen back to the past. When she fell asleep tonight, would it remain so the next morning? Instinct told her that nothing would change, that this was real. She was too lucid for this to be some imagining. But how? Why her, and why in general? She'd asked both Gasper and Arthur questions, but they were both superficial inquiries. Only the gods or magic would be capable of something like sending someone back into the past. Or perhaps not, perhaps there were forces beyond her knowing. Devilry? Something else altogether. Magic, Isabella reflected. I was too old to learn it when I became queen, but I might be able to form a monologue at this age. In truth, she had always wanted to learn magic, but her father had always forbidden it. Edgar the Great called it a man's discipline, unsuited for noble ladies. When she had tried to do so on her own, he had the tutors crack her knuckles with a stick. It was a long-enduring tradition and of Hayne for reasons that she couldn't possibly guess. Or perhaps she could understand, given the control it allowed noblemen and kings. Her father had sampled women as often as he did wine. He would marry a woman one week, welcome 2 mistresses in the next, then execute his wife in the third. She didn't think Edgar could love, but he certainly lusted. Isabella had once thought she was fortunate to be a legitimate princess, but it only meant that the shackles to the royal court were all the tighter, and shackles were ill-suited to swimming in a stormy sea. Isabella didn't honestly know how many siblings she had, but it must have been in the hundreds. Despite this, Edgar had been granted the title of the Great after his death. They cited his military and economic reforms. They cited his patronage of artists, which had caused a great resurgence in the humanities throughout Hayne. They cited his expansionist policies, which had seen the kingdom nearly double in size. They cited his vibrant court life, where there was a celebration and a ball nearly every week. They conveniently ignored, of course, the disaster his indiscretions would bring after his death. Her father had expended tremendous wealth to establish a good public image for himself. The more time that passed, the more Isabella had come to realize Edgar didn't deserve his title of Great. They praised him unilaterally, but the succession crisis to come was entirely his fault. His reign had been a brilliant fruit that was entirely rotten on the inside. The matter of succession entirely disinterested him. He never addressed it publicly, saying only that the gods will work out. As Isabella felt sleep creep up, she couldn't help but wonder if that was the reason she returned. Good morning, Your Highness, Alice said as she entered the room cheerfully. I was very surprised to hear you requested me as your personal attendant. Isabella smiled at the young girl without a word. It had been simple enough to ask for Alice, right now. The factionalism hadn't yet permeated the staff of the royal household. Isabella remembered Alice as a kind-hearted girl unsuited for the intrigues of the royal court soon to come. Someone tried to use Alice as a pawn, but she refused them. In return, she was framed for abusing one of the infant princes. Isabella didn't know if she could trust Alice fully, but she liked her cheery nature. Isabella had been reading the Eternal Word, the book that contained all the doctrines of the faith, for any answers about why she might have returned to the past. Now that the palace was waking up, she could start moving as well. She rose out of bed and put the book away in her dresser. Your pillows are all on the floor, Alice noted. Was there something wrong with them? Ah. Isabella looked at the pillows. In truth, all she could think about was Bernadetta smothering her until she'd pushed them off the bed. I think I'd prefer to sleep without them. Okay. Alice said. It may strain your neck, Your Highness. If it pleases, I could try and request different pillows. Isabella rubbed at her neck. She could feel some stiffness, but she hadn't been able to fall asleep at all until the pillows were away. Thank you, but no. Perhaps an extra blanket? I'll have it brought here before the end of the day, Alice promised. Could you speak to the major domo? Isabella continued. I'd like to go visit the Archbishop. There was a benefit of being one princess among dozens. It allowed some measure of discretion. The more people there were to keep track of, the less detailed the information tended to be. Isabella was a small speck on the king's mind when he had so many other siblings to contend with. She had taken to being quiet and reserved as a defense for that reason. If she said little, there were fewer things to take issue with. Being one royal among many came with its drawbacks, too. The Archbishop is too busy to visit with you presently, Your Highness, said the paladin firmly. He sends his regrets. Isabella looked at him. I'll wait. The paladin swallowed nervously. Isabella could tell by his expression that the Archbishop had said polite words, intending to shoo her away with niceties. The Archbishop was supposed to be the attendant for the religious matters of the whole royal family, but in reality, he dealt only with the royals that mattered. She hadn't expected to actually have an audience with the Archbishop, of course, rather, that had merely been an excuse to come to his church. I'll tour the grounds as I do, Isabella informed the paladin. then gathered herself to leave. As Isabella left, Alice followed close behind. "What a rude man," Alice said. "Your Highness, I believe he doesn't intend to come at all." "He has larger concerns," Isabella agreed. "And I have no allies, backing, fortune, or known talents. Only the Dovehane name." "The name should be enough," Alice said. Isabella gave Alice a consoling pat on the shoulder, then continued on to where she'd intended to go from the beginning, the Archbishoprics Library. As the attendant theologian to the royal family, the Archbishoprics Library was naturally their library as well. Any of the books were free to be used by the royal family. After her identity was verified by the guards, she proceeded inside. A few members of the clergymen serving in the archbishopric took note of her presence, but it wasn't entirely unusual for a member of the royal family to visit this library in particular. She quickly located the keeper of the books. "I need to locate some books," she said. The keeper looked up at her. "Certainly, Your Highness. Which do you wish to locate?" "I've compiled a list," Isabella said, retrieving a paper from within her dress sleeve and sliding it over. She read the first few entries in the paper as she passed it over. Genealogies of the nobility of Dovehane. Cartographies of Philip the Navigator. Central territories of Dovehane. Conquered territories of Edgar the Great. It continued onward from there, each title related to politics, history, cartography, or other such educational texts. Would Her Highness happen to be doing a favor for one of her brothers? The man asked as he read the list. When Isabella stared at him cryptically, he lowered his head and said, "Forgive me. It's not my place to ask. I believe this library has the majority of these. I'll order some of the monks to locate and bring them. It shouldn't take any longer than 10 minutes, Your Highness." Isabella nodded, walking away from the desk. She looked around the library. Alice, still by her side, asked, "May I ask why Her Highness is retrieving such books?" "To read them," Isabella answered dryly. Alice lowered her head and played with the hems of her sleeves after the non-response, uncertain if she should press further. Isabella had been joking, but people always took her seriously, it seemed. "They'll help me think," Isabella said. "About the future." "My future." Isabella had a solid memory, but nothing was without flaw. She didn't wish for anything to slip by her unnoticed, and for that reason, she intended to take a robust survey of the happenings within the kingdom. Logically, the more she succeeded in changing, the further her previous life and this one would diverge. But some things didn't change. People's desires and ambitions would be relatively constant, alongside their personalities and vulnerabilities. Territories, lands, discoveries. So long as she was aware of the current situation, she was confident in emerging on the other side of this. Indeed, she might exploit opportunities others had discovered or reveal scandals that were yet buried. As Isabella looked at the big picture, she was beginning to understand how large the opportunity granted to her truly was. "I heard the king announced he was purging the royal dungeons," someone said distantly. Isabella focused on the conversation. "Purging? You mean releasing them, or?" One of the monks continued. "Half and half," the first monk said. "If their family can pay an exorbitant, they're free to go. If they're not, apparently, he's just going to execute them." "What?" the second monk asked in alarm. "That. Well, I'm sure the king has a reason. It can't be as arbitrary as it sounds." "Did he explain why?" "This is just a rumor." The first monk's voice quieted. "But apparently, it was only to make room." Isabella closed her eyes. "The first cracks in the edifice are already showing," she reflected. "Sure, he'll get a tremendous inflow of cash, but there's a reason many of those people are in the dungeons. It astounds me how short-sighted he is. But I suppose it's natural. Our father made ruling over his subjects seem effortless. Edgar too only ever knew a time where his father's word was law, and any dissent was ruthlessly crushed. He thinks he can do the same thing. It wouldn't take long for a rude awakening that rattled the foundations of the kingdom, and revealed the royal weakness. It's hard to think I couldn't see the storm coming my first life. Chapter 5. As Isabella got a grasp of the situation and her course of action, she also weighed her options for removing the unwanted problem of Duke Albert. The first two of her routes were eliminated rather quickly: assassination. Specifically, assassination of either Duke Albert or King Edgar II. Isabella herself had never ordered an assassination, nor had she ever outright dismissed the idea. She believed that the two might warrant such a fate, frankly, but dirt like that was quite difficult to keep clean of. Besides, it was a pointless line of questioning. She had no resources or allies. Making Albert's interest with her would be impossible. She had tried that. In one of the lowest moments in her past life, she had tried disfiguring herself. The calmness with which Duke Albert had her injuries treated by the best priests had frightened even her, and from there, she truly lost all autonomy. Every waking moment, she was surrounded by Duke Albert's men, who never spoke a single word to her. Guarded, infantilized, isolated from all, and forbidden from stepping a foot outside her room. It had drained all hope from her, day by day. Isabella shook her head, dispelling the memories. But that hasn't happened to you anymore. It didn't happen. It won't happen. It was all a nightmare, but you've woken up. Her logical brain could argue the point well enough, but the arguments did little to dispel the memories, the tightened stomach, or the fear in her chest. Isabella had considered breaking apart King Edgar II and Albert somehow, but Albert had always been quite adroit at keeping the king placated. Edgar was a great admirer of the arts, and Albert fulfilled that need. Besides, she had no one to call upon for this task. Isabella was largely friendless. She had always been a solitary, lonely girl. I need a shield, Isabella decided. A ship to sail the stormy sea. No one can survive in tides of change as fierce as these without aid. To that end, she had isolated several patrons she might be able to call upon. Isabella sprawled out a map across the desk in her room. It demonstrated the different noble holdings throughout Bretagne. Alongside it, she placed her list of names. The first two have no holdings, she reflected. Arthur of Hamor, the archwizard's heir. Edgar would undoubtedly assent to match between them, but Arthur had never married. He had publicly expressed his intent to remain unwed years ago, and had stayed with that commitment all of her prior life. She couldn't think of anything to sway him from that. His abstinence had made Isabella more comfortable around him as queen. The second landless figure was the illegitimate son of the archbishop, Cesare. It was a far more dubious choice. Cesare would found a grand mercenary company, but that was later in his life. The archbishop, pious, desired a politically advantageous match for his son. He'd probably assent to the marriage, but King Edgar never would. Neither are worth the time to pursue, Isabella decided. But I should try to cultivate a friendly relationship with Arthur. Isabella peered at the remaining names. There were more than she thought, frankly, but few of them were trustworthy. And even fewer would see any value in a marriage with her, a princess with a mother of no renown. She set her fist down. Speculation is useless, she muttered. Isabella had assessed the situation. But the more time that she spent in planning, the more chance there was for opportunities to slip out of her grasp. Time had taught her that staying cooped up in her room writing letters would only get her so far. Isabella pulled the sash to summon her attendant. Not too long after, Alice entered. "How can I help, Your Highness?" said the girl brightly. "I need to speak to the king," she said decisively. Alice's smile wavered somewhat, but she nodded. Asterisk. "You want to attend?" Edgar repeated what Isabella had said. Servants diligently trimmed and filed his nails. "What business could you possibly have at the ambassadorial reception? Is this about your engagement?" He studied her. "I failed to see how it could be. The arriving guests hail from the Merchant Republic." Isabella chose her words carefully so as not to trigger his paranoia. "Yes, Your Majesty. And their patricians are forbidden by law from marrying outside the Republic." "Are they?" Edgar pulled his hand away, studying his nails before he devoted his full attention to Isabella. "So? Explain yourself. Seeking outside allies, perhaps?" hoping to be spirited away by some brutish Republican. He pressed tauntingly. "If you're going to ask for a chance to prove your worth, don't bother. I've given you one. Finish the meal in front of you before you ask for seconds." "I received a very fine education in managing an estate," Isabella said. "I know the art of stewardship and diplomacy well. I'm confident that I can secure better trade deals in the ambassadorial reception than the kingdom currently enjoys." Edgar laughed, waving away the servants that had been tending to his nails. They skulked away eagerly, and he devoted his full attention to her. "Are you honestly trying to say that you know better than my attendant diplomats?" "Yes, Your Majesty." Isabella nodded. Edgar's amusement faded from his face, and he walked very close to her. He retrieved his sheathed sword which had been leaning up against the wall, and traced its pommel, handle, and hilt with his finger. His eyes stared into hers, and she did her best to stand proud without giving the impression she was challenging him. "Why?" he finally asked. "Those in attendance wish to maintain the status quo that our father established," Isabella explained. "But many of those deals were made years ago. Now, the royal court is at the apex of its power." King Edgar inhaled, and though he tried to conceal his expression, Isabella could tell that he liked her words. "And why should I not simply pass that directive on to those who are already attending?" "Because they have no interest in further strengthening the crown's position," Isabella said. "Whereas all that I have is tied only to the Dovehane name." "You're a woman," Edgar pointed out, stepping away as he tied his sword to his belt. "The envoys would view your attendance as an insult." "Women aren't barred from public offices in the Republic of Ambrose," Isabella said, prompting a disbelieving stare from Edgar. "They've even once had a serene dogaressa instead of a serene doge." Edgar's stare finally broke into a smile. "You seem to be growing up. It's good of you to step up for me. Overdue, even." "Thank you, Your Majesty." Isabella lowered her head. He stepped about, thinking, then looked at her decisively. "How confident are you of succeeding?" "At maintaining what we have?" 100%. "At gaining more?" 90%. Edgar looked to his bodyguard. She broke it down into percentages. "Isn't that quaint? Would that every one of the imbeciles around me could do such a thing?" He looked back at her, then said decisively, "Very well, sister. You'll be the primary ambassador for the reception." Isabella's hands clenched involuntarily. "Primary ambassador, Your Majesty?" "But Count Faust, it's a temporary appointment, mind." "I don't trust Count Faust," Edgar interrupted. "Worked for our father for 20 years, did nothing but good service. He needs to know that he can be replaced. He needs to work harder. In case he has anything planned, he needs to know that the crown is always watching." Isabella swallowed her thoughts. "Generally, if you have a loyal servant, you reward them, no? You make sure they're going to stay loyal. But he's punishing loyalty?" "I can't speak the Ambrosian language as well as Count Faust can," Isabella said cautiously, honestly not wishing for the appointment. Edgar held his arms out. "Well, make do. Do I need to spell out every little detail? This will make me some enemies," Isabella thought. "I just wanted to attend, and now I'm angering the primary ambassador of the kingdom, and his allies that benefit from his appointment." The role came with its downsides, but all told, it would offer opportunities in equal measure if she handled it properly. Some would come to think that she had the king's favor. Pivotally, it would give her an excuse to talk to several of the prominent nobles in attendance, each of whom had an interest in the relations with the Republic of Ambrose. 3 of the people she might get engaged to in way of Duke Albert would be in attendance. "I will ensure my conduct is unimpeachable," she promised. "Spare me the promises. Just do it right," King Edgar said. "I'll have a reward prepared for you if it does. What do you want? Art, a horse, some new dresses? Jewelry?" Before she could answer, he shook his head and walked for the door. "I can't be bothered. I'll give you some coin if you do well. Just buy what you want." Isabella smiled. That was precisely what she would have asked for. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. On her way back to her quarters, Isabella veered from her path and went to the furthest wing of the palace. The royal palace was built on a hill overlooking the capital. There was one tower in particular which bridged off a great distance, suspended in the air above the city. It was the residence of the Archwizard and his students. "Your Highness," Alice said nervously. "Are you sure we should be here?" The path to the Archwizard's residence was a large bridge on which gargoyles looking inward had been placed on every inch. They seemed like a demonic guard of honor that might welcome a returning king. There were no knights or guards anywhere, but the place seemed more dangerous than any other wing of the palace. "We're fine," Isabella promised. Isabella walked to one of the gargoyles that was slightly off-center and pushed in its nose. A light came on in its eyes. "Inform Arthur of Hamor that Princess Isabella is looking for him," she spoke toward the gargoyle. A few moments later, the light in its eyes dimmed. Isabella stepped away calmly. Alice looked all around at the gargoyles ahead while Isabella watched the door leading into the tower. In time, it opened. Arthur, dressed as properly as ever, crossed the bridge with his typical mask of propriety on his face. "Your Highness shouldn't be aware of the messenger gargoyle," Arthur said in way of greeting. "Only the king and those within the Archwizard's residence should know." "Is knowledge a crime?" she asked in turn. "No, but—" He sighed, then adjusted his glasses. "Someone may think I told Her Highness of it." "But you didn't," she responded. Arthur looked around, then back at her. "I haven't found anything like the condition Your Highness told me of, but I'm still looking." Isabella shook her head. "This is another matter. Would you like to attend the ambassadorial reception tomorrow?" Arthur narrowed his eyes. "Why does that matter?" "I've been appointed the primary ambassador," Isabella said. "And I can help you attend." Both Alice and Arthur, who were hearing this news for the first time, looked at Isabella in a mixture of disbelief and caution. "Meaning no disrespect toward you. I find it difficult to believe King Edgar would appoint a woman to that role," Arthur said. "It was his spontaneous decision," Isabella explained wearily. "He gave me the title temporarily when I expressed my desire to attempt to buoy the crown's position." He nodded, crossing his arms. "Even if you're lying, there's no harm in indulging you. What's your offer?" Isabella looked at Alice without a word, indicating she wished to speak to him alone. Her attendant dipped her head and backed away, taking the signal well. She liked Alice, but liking and trusting were separate matters. When Alice was sufficiently far away, Isabella looked back. "I'll help you secure a supply of magic materials that can only be found in the Republic of Ambrose," she said, making him raise a brow. "In return, you'll help me form a monologue so I can begin practicing magic." Chapter 6. Do you think that the path of magic is something that you can simply decide to walk down on a whim? Arthur questioned with some indignance after her request. "Not at all," Isabella said with a shake of her head. "Then you should be aware that you'll need at least a year of study to even contemplate forming a monologue," Arthur continued, crossing his arms. "And that each individual's monologue needs to be highly personalized to fit within the matrix of their own mind." She took a deep breath, pondering what she could tell him. That he had already taught her most of what she needed to know in a past life? It was difficult for her to believe what had happened to her. Telling another. "I have studied," Isabella answered without elaborating. Arthur looked down at her, then uncrossed his arms and pushed up his glasses. He offered his gloved hand. "Show me." Isabella studied his hand, then looked up at him uncertainly. "If you've learned, there's no need for words," Arthur continued. "He's offering me a portion of his own mana to manipulate to demonstrate," Isabella realized. Once she did, she took his hand gladly. Isabella felt a faint tingling in her hand. Soon after, mana bridged from him to her, the chaotic energy dancing around in her body. It was leashed by Arthur's will, but even leashed, its potency couldn't be underestimated. She grasped it firmly with her force of will, and then began to manipulate it as Arthur had once taught her. Forming a monologue could be likened to pottery. One needed to take the fragile raw materials, and with them, create a vessel that threatened to constantly collapse into itself. Isabella had formed countless monologues, pining for something that she had never been able to possess. They all crumbled to nothingness once they were finished, unable to maintain themselves in her developed mind. Naturally, she finished forming the monologue quickly. It wasn't her best work, she was quite rusty after having been bedridden for months, but it did finish. When she opened her eyes again, Arthur stared down at her with a modicum of surprise on his face. Arthur pulled away his hand, staring down at it. He was likely studying the remnants of the monologue before it crumbled into nothingness. When it had, he looked at her evenly. "I was under the impression that King Edgar had disallowed all of his daughters from learning magic," Arthur said. "Who taught you?" Isabella stared at him cryptically. "I suppose I can't expect an answer." He studied her. "I won't make any promises. That was decent work you did, but you're quite old to join the path of magic. It wouldn't be unheard of, but it wouldn't be common, either." "Meaning you've agreed?" Isabella raised a brow. "I don't have any other way to include you in the event than by taking you as my partner. I'm aware that might be troublesome for you." Arthur looked conflicted. "There's no other way?" Inwardly she was a little stung by his reluctance, but she explained, "My posting is a temporary one born of the king's whimsy. The reception is tomorrow, and most of the attendants are already codified. I can't change things." "Very well. You'll have to forgive me in advance for fulfilling few of my duties as a partner," he said. "I'm greatly interested in materials sourced from Ambrose. Their magical expertise would be peerless without the existence of my master." "You don't need to apologize for something I'm going to do as well," Isabella told him. Arthur nodded. "Farewell, then. I'll receive you tomorrow, an hour before the event begins." Arthur turned to walk away without waiting for her response. Isabella didn't give one, merely turning back and rejoining with her maid Alice. Alice beamed at her proudly as she said, "No one saw a thing, Your Highness." Isabella was about to ask what she meant, but then considered things from her perspective. She'd asked Alice to walk away, had talked with Arthur, then held his hand for a while. She sighed when she realized the misunderstanding that had arisen. And on top of that, "He'll be my partner for the ambassadorial reception," Isabella told Alice. Alice's already wide smile managed to widen, somehow. Isabella didn't know how those cheeks of hers didn't burst. Isabella walked down the hall with a bitter half-smile. If she denied it now, she'd sound like nothing more than an embarrassed young girl bashful at her first romance. Besides, rumors were sure to spread regardless once Arthur arrived as her partner. And the rumors would die just as quickly when nothing happened between them. Still, it wouldn't be the worst thing, Isabella thought. Provided, of course, that he wasn't the one to kill me. That might put a damper on my enthusiasm, she thought darkly. "I'm going to check the arrangements for the reception," Isabella told Alice. "Learn the staff, the attendees." She sighed. "Brush up on my Ambrosan, and find someone who can speak the language better than I can." All this preparation was expected of her in merely a day. King Edgar too was irredeemably ignorant of what an ambassadorial reception entailed. ****. A dignified man with slicked white hair and a stern impression looked up upon Gaspar of Forseth, Knight Commander of the Holy Paladins. The blond man towered over him, but he didn't seem intimidated in the least. "He's replacing me with an 18-year-old girl, whose mother was from some lowly house whose name I can't even remember," Count Faust said, more harshly than he'd intended. Gaspar put his hand on the pommel of his sword. "You should remember you speak of a Dauphine, Count Faust." Faust closed his eyes, taming his temper. "Can you at least tell me why? Did His Majesty give a reason?" "It's a temporary posting for Princess Isabella to treat with the Republic of Ambrose," Gaspar explained simply. "Ah, yes, a temporary posting, quick and easy. They are only our most important trade partners," Faust said sarcastically. "What could go wrong?" "His Majesty said that it should serve as a reminder that there's always room for improvement," Gaspar said, but even he didn't seem too pleased to give the order. "I'm merely his messenger, my lord." The Count realized there was no use getting angry at the Knight Commander. "I apologize for my tone, Knight Commander. Please let His Majesty know I have received the decree." Gaspar dipped his head. "It's nothing worth apologizing for, my lord." When Gaspar walked away, Faust walked over to his room's window and peered out at the city below. It sounded like a demotion. But perhaps it was an opportunity. If things go wrong, it'll be ample proof how indispensable I am to our diplomatic efforts, Faust thought. I don't know what that girl was thinking, accepting such a posting. Perhaps she was simply chosen at random. I spent much of my life picking up the pieces from the many diplomatic faux pas that Brad Edgar made when he was a prince. This would merely be another in a long line of poor choices. Forgive me, but I'll have to ruin your night, Isabella. Faust shook his head. The royal court had always been somewhat ruthless, but it seemed that the accession of a new king would redouble things. He'd need to get with his allies, let them know the circumstances. They'd definitely back him in making the night a difficult one for the young princess. A young, sheltered girl like that, barely an adult, would almost definitely crack beneath the pressure. Once Isabella had made a mess of negotiations, Faust would be the natural choice to go in and repair things. The circumstances of Devhane's alliance with Ambrose might be slightly worse, but that was a sacrifice he was willing to make. There would be much need of diplomats with a tyrant like King Edgar II reigning. Prince Claude. Faust sighed. You would have made such a better king than your bastard of a brother. Asterisk. There came a knock at Isabella's door. Looking at the grandfather clock in the room, Arthur had arrived precisely 1 hour before the event began. She gave one last look at herself in the mirror. For an event like this, she had decided to wear something austere. Even the least fancy of her dresses still felt somewhat decadent. It was an off-white dress trimmed with ornate beige flourishes. It was comfortable, which had been her largest concern, and came with equally comfortable shoes. This promised to be a long, exhaustive event, and she didn't want to break her ankles wearing heels. If what she knew of the Ambrosian people was right, they wouldn't look down upon her dress. Alice opened the door for the guest, and Arthur stood out front. He dressed in the same natural tones with a traditional green shoulder cape draped on his right shoulder. He carried a book with him, neatly tucked in the crook of his arm. He looked at her politely. You look well, Your Highness, he said. Isabella almost laughed at his stiff, ill-fitting compliment, but managed to contain herself. Shall we go? I've prepared a carriage, he said, then gestured to the hall. After you. Asterisk. Arthur had begrudgingly accepted Isabella's request to attend as her partner to the ambassadorial reception. It was a difficult thing for him to get an opportunity to speak to Ambrosian envoys, and he'd take it, even if that meant treading the fine line of neutrality his master had established. Fortunately, the princess wasn't especially talkative or demanding. He liked to be alone with his thoughts, and it seemed that she did too. She didn't protest at the humble carriage that the archwizard had lent him. Once the both of them had settled in and the carriage set off toward the event hall, Isabella looked at Arthur. Count Faust is going to try something to undermine me at the ambassadorial reception, Isabella told him. Arthur, who'd been looking out the window, looked back at her. How do you know? Because I attempted to reach out to the people that are his allies, and managed to sound them out from their reactions, Isabella said. I have a relatively surefire approach which I'm confident in using on the visiting Ambrosian envoys, but I do have something to ask of you. Arthur looked back out the window. I knew there would be something. Please don't help them denigrate me, she said. That's all. Arthur was taken aback, and looked back at her. Don't help them denigrate you? Correct, she confirmed with a curt nod. Arthur stared at her a few moments, silently. He voiced his thoughts honestly, asking, partners are intended to support one another, no? But you don't want to be my partner, Isabella pointed out. This is merely an exchange. That's. Arthur trailed off, finding it difficult to dispute or agree with what she said. Objectively speaking, there would be more benefit to you to work with Faust, Isabella outlined. Indeed, he'll likely approach you. All I ask is that you do nothing. It would mean a great deal to me. I won't forget it. She means it, Arthur realized. She'd be pleased if all that I did was nothing. Forget taking her side, helping her. She'd be grateful for me not to hinder her? Arthur wondered if she was trying to trigger his guilt, make him take her side in this dispute out of pity. But she didn't seem to be trying to act pitiful. Rather, she looked out the window lost in thought, clearly planning for the afternoon ahead. "You should already know I practice neutrality," he finally said. Isabella looked at him, gave a smile with an intent he couldn't quite decipher, then looked back out the window. She was the very picture of composure. Watching her, Arthur somehow felt this spur-of-the-moment choice to attend the reception wouldn't be a decision that he regretted. Asterisk. Isabella alighted from the carriage, gratefully accepting Arthur's hand to steady herself. Once she had her feet on the ground, she looked up at the ambassadorial hall. Compared to the royal palace loomed large above the city in the background, it seemed small, but was a nevertheless stately marble building. Others were arriving. Most of them were looking at her and Arthur. In a manner of speaking, this would be her debutante ball. Not into the social world, but into the cutthroat arena of royal politics.